For many people, Jackson Pollock is really the first artist that we think of when we think of, or if we think of, abstract expressionism, and arguably he best exemplifies this idea of gestural expressionism. Now, he's going to be really discovered in one article in Life magazine in about 1949. They run this large profile on him and he finds overnight success, which really propels him into this high art world, whereas prior to that he was just that guy who does a lot of paint splatters. And that's really common. In his case, he gets to live to see it, but in many artists' cases, of course, it happens after they die through auctions and other things. Now, by about 1950, he had refined his technique and was producing large-scale abstract canvases. And to give you an idea, he's creating these massive canvases either on the wall or oftentimes on the floor, applying paints which are frequently not artist paints but house paints, which make it that much more difficult for us to determine the authenticity of a Pollock, and he's applying it in a number of different ways: scubbling, brushwork, but oftentimes throwing the paint, sometimes flicking it off of a paint stick, sometimes tossing it at the canvas. But either way, he's applying it in this way that really captures his gestures, his movements, and arguably his mood. So let's look at his painting number 1, 1950, and I should point out that when it comes to Jackson Pollock, the official name that he gives it is generally a number, and the way it works is the first painting that he does in 1950 is known as number 1, 1950. The next painting would be number 2, 1950. It's pretty straightforward. If you see a name that's applied to it, in this case, Lavender Mist, it means that some art historian or curator has applied a name to it and it has stuck, but it is not a name that was applied by Jackson Pollock himself. Now, again, we talked about the application, the technique. You can kind of get a sense of that, and we get a sense of that very large canvas as we look at this image, and also a sense of why he was known as Jack the Dripper, one of the more unfortunate nicknames in art history. Now, the work is both spontaneous and choreographed. It is spontaneous in that he's not planning his movements, but at the same time, there is a broad plan. For example, there is an undertone. He has painted the canvas before he applies the more splatter and tossed paint marks. So there is an element of choreography. But also that choreography comes in because we're seeing a canvas that captures his movement. So he's literally immersing himself in the art. Now, his work has been linked to ideas of the collective unconscious, this Jungian idea that all of us at some level are somehow connected at this very broad unconscious level. And he's kind of trying to tap into that by removing any obvious symbol. And in the act of removing symbols, he's trying to create something that is arguably universal. We can all look at it and get that sense of a mirror, get that sense of looking in ourselves. Now, he also was tied to the surrealists at one point for his apparent release of the conscious and use of the subconscious in creation. He's doing that by moving so quickly that his subconscious mind is required to do most of the heavy lifting, as opposed to the conscious mind. It's kind of like if you take an exam and you fly through it really, really fast, and then you go back and your conscious mind goes, I should really reconsider some of these answers, and you always get those answers wrong because you should have left it where it was. Same idea. The subconscious is more accurate and faster acting, and so by moving much faster and not allowing himself to think consciously, he captures that element of the subconscious, very similar to the surrealists. Now, the size of this painting is, of course, quite massive, as we see here in this photo that I took in front of it in my more heavy rock days. Now, The size and lack of focus move him away from traditional easel painting, which is not surprising in the age of abstraction. It had to happen at some point. Also, that idea of holding up a mirror as opposed to giving us an image that we're supposed to interpret in a certain way is arguably sort of the far end of the spectrum from someone like Michelangelo, where he's trying to give us a specific message in visual terms. Pollock is trying to give us a way to come up with our own message through the use of visual terms. Now, unfortunately, Jackson Pollock will of course pass at age 44 in a car wreck. But now let's look at the painting and tear it apart a little bit, as much as we really can. Now, obviously, you can look at this and go, all right, I'm going to spend 3 to 5 minutes in front of it. Obviously, it's much larger than what you see on your screen. And you're going to start seeing things. You might see some kind of shape. Now, your conscious mind knows there are no shapes here. As I've told you, everything here is spontaneous. But what you're going to see is things will start to appear. Probably faces. Humans are evolved to do that, to see faces everywhere. It's really, really common. But there's something else you can look at, especially if you're trying to find a way into the painting, a way to really start to learn about the painting. And that is, look for patterns, because as I said, he's moving around, he's using repeated forms, and so, for example, he might be flicking paint off a paint stick, and so we see this black mark here, which tends to indicate that, but then it repeats here. And a similar form is here, same curve. And you could argue one of these is probably along the same lines, and what you're seeing is him walking down the canvas, flicking that paint, probably moving from left to right. You'll notice that we can actually tear apart his movements bit by bit as he moves around the canvas, as he uses different colors. You might even find that maybe there's a footprint in the middle of it, or there's going to be an area where maybe he supported himself on his hand or his finger, and you're going to see that. So if you're really at a loss with the Jackson Pollock, start tearing it apart and figuring out how he moved around it. Look at it as a record of movement as much as a mirror for your own internal thought processes.